I let them take everything, because I needed them to believe I had nothing left to fight for. The day my daughter-in-law smiled across the kitchen island and slid those papers toward me, her voice soft as honey, I already knew what they were. Transfer of ownership. Authorization forms. Just to make things easier for you, Margaret, she said, tilting her head like she was doing me a favor. My son, Daniel, stood beside her, not meeting my eyes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets like a boy who had done something wrong but didn't want to admit it. I remember the sunlight coming through the window that morning, catching the edge of the granite countertop, making everything look warm, normal, safe. But there was nothing safe about that moment. I had spent 42 years in that house. Every inch of it carried a memory: birthday dinners, quiet Sunday mornings, the sound of my husband's laughter echoing down the hallway before heart disease took him 3 winters ago. And now here they were, standing in the same kitchen where I had raised him, asking me to sign it all away like it was paperwork for a routine appointment. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I picked up the pen, felt its weight in my hand, and signed my name exactly where she pointed. Sophie's smile widened just a fraction, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I was. Daniel let out a breath I didn't know he'd been holding, like some invisible pressure had just been released. This is really for the best, Mom, he said quietly, still avoiding my gaze. For the best. I repeated those words in my head as I set the pen down. I nodded once, slow and calm, as if I agreed. In that moment, I could see the entire story they had written for me: an aging widow who couldn't manage finances, who needed help, who would be more comfortable somewhere smaller, somewhere simpler. They thought I hadn't noticed the changes over the past year. The way Sophie started handling the mail. The way Daniel stopped including me in conversations about bills or repairs. The way decisions were made without me, then presented as if they were already final. It had been gradual, almost gentle at first. Then faster. Sharper. Until everything I owned was no longer truly mine. And still, I said nothing. I smiled. I thanked them. Because the truth is, I had already seen enough. I had already made the calls I needed to make. They thought that moment at the counter was the beginning of the end for me. They didn't realize it was the beginning of something else entirely. Something quieter. Something patient. As Sophie gathered the papers and stacked them neatly, her fingers tapping them into alignment, she looked satisfied, like someone who had just closed a deal. "We'll take care of everything from here," she said. I believed her. That was exactly what I needed them to do. Take control. Take responsibility. Take everything they thought I no longer had the strength to protect. Because when people think you're powerless, they stop hiding who they really are. And that's when you learn exactly how to take it all back. 48 hours before I signed those papers, the house was still quiet in a way that felt familiar, not empty but settled, like it had finally learned how to breathe again after my husband passed. I woke up just after 6 in the morning, the same time I had for decades, even though there was no one left to make coffee for but myself. The hardwood floors were cool under my feet as I walked into the kitchen, and for a moment, everything felt unchanged. The same cabinets. The same view of the backyard through the window above the sink. The same chipped mug I had been using for years. I poured my coffee slowly, watching the steam rise, and I remember thinking how strange it was that grief had become something quiet instead of overwhelming. It had settled into the corners of the house, into the spaces between moments, into the silence that followed me from room to room. Daniel had not always been distant. After his father died, he came by almost every day for the first few weeks, bringing groceries I did not ask for, fixing things that were not broken, hovering like he was trying to fill a space that could never really be replaced. Sophie came with him sometimes, always polite, always composed, always watching. Back then, her kindness had a softness to it, something that felt genuine. Or maybe I just wanted to believe it was. It changed slowly. Not all at once. That is how you miss it if you are not paying attention. The first shift was small. Sophie started organizing the mail, saying it would help me stay on top of bills. Then she offered to set up online statements, explaining that it was easier than sorting through envelopes. Daniel agreed with her, of course. He always did. I let it happen. It felt harmless at the time. Helpful, even. Then came the conversations that happened without me. Decisions about repairs, about insurance, about accounts I had managed on my own for years. I would walk into the room and they would fall quiet for just a second too long before someone smiled and changed the subject. I noticed. I always noticed. But I said nothing. Because part of me thought this was what getting older looked like. You step back. You let the younger ones take over. You trust that they are doing what is best. That morning, 2 days before everything changed, Sophie stood in that same kitchen with me, leaning lightly against the counter, her tone unusually warm. She asked about my sleep, about my medication, about whether I had considered downsizing. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have. Downsizing. Such a simple word for something that meant leaving behind a lifetime. I stirred my coffee slowly, listening to her talk about convenience, about ease, about how I deserved something simpler. Daniel nodded along, his expression careful, measured, like he was trying to say the right thing without saying too much. I watched him then, really watched him, and for the first time I saw it clearly. Not hesitation. Not concern. Calculation. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not a sudden realization, but a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect. They were not trying to help me. They were preparing me. Preparing me to step aside. To make room. To hand over control without resistance. I took a sip of my coffee and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then I smiled. A small, polite smile that gave nothing away. I will think about it, I said. And Sophie smiled back, satisfied, as if the conversation had gone exactly the way she wanted. Daniel relaxed, just a little. They thought they were guiding me toward a decision. They did not understand that I had already made one. Because when people start speaking in careful tones, when they begin choosing their words too precisely, it means they are hiding something. And I had spent enough years in that house, in that family, to recognize when the truth was no longer being spoken out loud. I finished my coffee, set the mug in the sink, and looked out the window at the yard my husband had loved. The grass needed trimming. The fence needed repair. Small things I had been putting off. Small things that suddenly felt important again. Because if they were planning to take everything from me, they were going to have to believe I would let them. Completely. Without question. Without resistance. And I was very good at letting people believe exactly what they wanted to believe. The next morning, I drove across town to a place I had not visited in nearly a year, a small brick office tucked between a dental clinic and a travel agency, the kind of place most people would pass without noticing, but I knew exactly where it was because my husband had trusted it for decades, and I had learned a long time ago that trust, when placed correctly, becomes a foundation you can return to when everything else begins to shift. The sign on the door still read Carter and Wells Legal Services, the gold lettering slightly faded but steady, unchanged. I sat in my car for a moment before stepping out, my hands resting on the steering wheel, not trembling, not unsure, just still, because this was the point where quiet observation turns into deliberate action. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, asking how she could help, and when I gave my name, there was a flicker of recognition, followed by a call placed. Down the hall, within minutes, Thomas Wells himself appeared, older now, his hair more silver than I remembered, but his eyes just as sharp. He greeted me with a warmth that felt real, not rehearsed, and that alone told me I had come to the right place. We sat in his office, the same one where my husband and I had signed documents years ago, documents built on mutual respect and clarity, not confusion, not manipulation. I did not waste time explaining emotions. I simply told him what had been happening, the changes, the documents, the conversations that no longer included me, the way control had quietly shifted without confrontation. He listened without interrupting, his expression tightening slightly with each detail. not surprised, but concerned in a way that felt grounded. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, asking one simple question. "Have you signed anything yet?" And I shook my head, slowly, because I had not at that point, not yet. He nodded once, as if that single answer confirmed everything he needed to know. Then he stood, walked over to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder with my name on it, the paper inside crisp, organized, untouched by anyone who should not have access. He placed it on the desk between us and opened it carefully, pointing to documents my husband had arranged years before his passing, structures designed to protect, not just provide, clauses that required clear consent, verified understanding, safeguards that could not be bypassed without raising questions, real questions, the kind that leave a trail. I felt something settle inside me then, not relief, but certainty, because what Sophie and Daniel were attempting was not as clean as they believed. It was rushed, overconfident, built on the assumption that I would not notice until it was too late. Thomas explained the risks calmly, not with alarm, but with precision. Any sudden transfers, any documents signed under pressure, any inconsistencies in account access could be challenged, reviewed, reversed if necessary, but only if handled correctly, only if we moved carefully, strategically. Not emotionally. I nodded, because that was exactly what I intended to do. There was no need for anger, no need for confrontation, not yet. I asked him what he would recommend, and he gave me a plan that was simple in structure but powerful in execution. Let them proceed, let them reveal their intentions fully, document everything, do not resist openly, because resistance would make them cautious, and caution would make them careful. What we needed was for them to feel secure, to believe there were no obstacles, no questions, no consequences. I stood to leave, the folder now in my hands, heavier than paper should feel, not because of its contents, but because of what it represented: control, knowledge, timing. As I walked back to my car, the late morning sun felt different, sharper somehow, more defined. I was not reacting anymore, I was preparing, and when I returned home, Sophie was already there, standing in the kitchen, her expression bright, her tone light, asking if I had thought about what we discussed. I smiled, the same calm, measured smile I had practiced for years, and I told her yes, I had. I told her I trusted them, completely. And as I watched the satisfaction settle into her expression, I knew we were exactly where we needed to be. The shift from suggestion to expectation happened that same evening, subtle enough that anyone not paying attention would have missed it, but I had spent too many years reading between words to ignore the difference. Sophie moved through the kitchen with a kind of quiet confidence that had not been there before, opening drawers without asking, rearranging things I had kept in the same place for decades, her movements smooth, deliberate, as if she already belonged to the space in a way that no longer included me. Daniel followed her lead without realizing it, or perhaps he did realize and chose not to question it. Either way, the result was the same. I was no longer being consulted, I was being managed. Dinner that night was calm on the surface, the kind of calm that feels rehearsed, plates placed neatly, conversation light but controlled. Sophie asked about small things, my sleep, the weather, the neighbor's new fence. All of it harmless, all of it unnecessary, and Daniel nodded along, adding comments here and there, but never once looking directly at me when it mattered. I let the silence stretch when it needed to. I let them fill it with their own words, because people reveal more when they are trying to maintain control than when they are challenged. It was Sophie who eventually shifted the tone, setting her fork down with quiet precision, her voice still gentle but carrying a firmness that had not been there before. She began to talk about practicality, about how difficult it must be for me to maintain a property this size, about how much easier things would be if everything were consolidated, streamlined, simplified. Each word carefully chosen, each sentence building on the last. And Daniel, sitting beside her, agreed with small nods, offering just enough support to make it seem like a shared concern rather than a coordinated effort. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression neutral, because this was not the moment to react, this was the moment to observe. Sophie mentioned the paperwork again, this time more directly, explaining how transferring certain responsibilities would allow them to take care of everything. Her tone, reassuring, almost comforting, But underneath it was something else, something sharper, something that assumed compliance. I could see it in the way she held my gaze just a second longer than necessary, waiting for agreement, waiting for confirmation that the plan was moving forward. I gave it to her, a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement, nothing more, but it was enough. I saw the relief pass between them, quick and subtle. Like a signal exchanged without words, Daniel finally looked at me then. But only briefly, his expression softening just enough to suggest he believed this was the right thing, that he was helping, that he was protecting me from something I could no longer manage on my own. That belief made it easier for him, easier to stand there while the ground shifted beneath me, easier to accept what was happening without questioning how it had begun. I excused myself after dinner, not because I needed to, but because leaving at the right moment matters. It gives people space to speak freely, and I knew they would. From the hallway I could hear their voices lower, more relaxed now that I was no longer in the room. Sophie's tone confident, Daniel's quieter, uncertain at times but ultimately agreeing, always agreeing. I did not need to hear every word to understand the direction of the conversation. I had already seen enough. I went upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind me, and for a moment I allowed myself to stand still in the center of the room, looking around at the life I had built, the photographs, the furniture, the small details that carried meaning only I could fully understand. There was no anger in that moment, no fear, just clarity, because when someone believes they are guiding you toward a decision, they stop hiding the path they have already chosen, and that path was becoming more visible with every step they took. I sat down at the edge of the bed, folded my hands, and let the silence settle, not empty, not heavy, but steady, controlled, exactly where I needed it to be, because the more certain they became, the easier it would be to let them go exactly where they thought they were leading me. The next morning, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the roles inside it had quietly shifted overnight. Sophie was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed as if she had somewhere important to be, her posture straight, her movements efficient. She greeted me with a brightness that felt practiced, not warm, and I could see it now clearly. The performance. The way she adjusted her tone depending on what she needed. Daniel was at the table, scrolling through his phone, his coffee untouched, and when I entered, he looked up just long enough to acknowledge me before returning his attention to the screen. That small detail told me more than any words could have. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the counter, waiting, because moments like this always come when you allow silence to do its work. It was Sophie who spoke first, her voice calm, controlled, but firmer than it had been before. She said they had been thinking more about what was best for me, about how important it was that I not feel overwhelmed, about how they wanted to make sure I was comfortable moving forward, each sentence carefully layered, building towards something she had already decided. I nodded slowly, not interrupting, letting her finish, because I knew where this was going long before she said it out loud, and when she finally did, it came with a softness that almost made it sound kind. She said it might be time for me to consider staying somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage, and Daniel, without hesitation, agreed, his voice quieter but aligned, as if the decision had already been made between them long before this conversation began. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle, not because I needed comfort, but because timing matters, reactions matter. And this was not the moment to give them anything they were not expecting. I set the cup down carefully and looked at them both, really looked this time, not as family, but as people making a choice. Sophie met my gaze without hesitation, confident, certain, already seeing the outcome she wanted. Daniel looked at me briefly, then away again, his expression conflicted but not enough to stop what was happening. That was the moment I understood something important. This was no longer a discussion. It was an announcement, and announcements do not require agreement, only compliance. I nodded once, slowly, and said that I understood, that I had been thinking about it too, that maybe they were right, that maybe it was time for a change. The relief that followed was immediate, visible in the way Sophie's shoulders relaxed, in the way Daniel exhaled quietly, as if a burden had been lifted. But it was not their burden that had been lifted, it was their uncertainty. They no longer had to wonder if I would resist, if I would question, if I would make this difficult. I had removed all of that with a single sentence, and in doing so, I gave them exactly what they needed to move forward without caution. Sophie began to speak again, more freely now, outlining next steps, talking about listings, about timelines, about how quickly everything could be arranged, her confidence growing with each word. And I listened, not because I needed the details, but because details reveal intention, and intention leaves patterns, and patterns are what you follow when you are preparing to take something back. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink, my movements steady, unhurried, as if nothing significant had just been decided, as if I were simply going about my morning routine. I told them I would start sorting through my things, that I would not need much time, that I would make it easy for everyone, and Sophie smiled, a genuine smile this time, because ease was exactly what she wanted. Ease meant no resistance, no complications, no obstacles. Daniel nodded again, still not quite meeting my eyes, but satisfied enough to let the moment pass without question. I walked past them and toward the stairs, feeling their attention linger just long enough to confirm that everything had gone according to plan, their plan, not mine. And as I reached the top step, I allowed myself a brief pause, just long enough to let the silence settle behind me, because the moment you give someone everything they think they have won, they stop looking for what they might have missed, and that is when the real work begins. I began packing that same afternoon, not because I was in a hurry, but because movement creates the illusion of agreement, and agreement was exactly what they needed to see. I started with the simplest things first, the drawers in my bedroom, neatly folding clothes I had worn for years, placing them into boxes with care, not sentimentality, just order, because order makes people comfortable. And I wanted them comfortable. Sophie checked in more than once, her tone light, almost cheerful, asking if I needed help, offering suggestions about what to keep and what to let go, each question framed as kindness, but every suggestion leaning toward less, toward smaller, toward easier. I thanked her each time and declined, gently, consistently, because doing it myself gave me control over what appeared to be leaving and what was simply being set aside. Daniel hovered less, his presence fading in and out of the house, busy with calls, errands, anything that allowed him to avoid direct involvement. And I noticed that too, because absence can say as much as presence, especially when it becomes a pattern. By the second day, the boxes had begun to fill the hallway, labeled neatly in my handwriting: kitchen, bedroom, personal, documents. That last one I kept close, always within reach, because not everything that appears ordinary is meant to be treated that way. Sophie commented on my organization, calling it impressive, efficient, and I smiled, because efficiency was exactly what she wanted to believe she was seeing, not preparation, not intention. Just a woman making things easier for everyone else. I let her believe that. I let both of them believe that, because belief shapes behavior, and their behavior was becoming more open, more revealing with each passing hour. I overheard conversations that were no longer careful, discussions about timing, about listing the house, about how quickly things could move once I was out. Not once did they question whether they should wait, whether I might need more time, because in their minds, that decision had already been made. And I had agreed to it, completely, without hesitation. That was the version of me they were working with now, the version that nodded, that complied, that made things simple, and I maintained that version with precision, never contradicting it, never stepping outside of it, because consistency builds trust, and trust lowers defenses. On the third morning, I made a quiet trip out of the house while they were still asleep, the same route I had taken before, the same office, the same calm exchange of information, but this time there was more to share, more details, more documentation. Thomas listened again, his expression unchanged, steady, focused. He reviewed what I brought, noting timelines, identifying patterns, confirming what we both already understood, that what was happening was not accidental, not casual, but structured, intentional, and that made it predictable, and predictable situations can be managed. He outlined the next steps carefully, emphasizing patience, emphasizing timing, reminding me that once everything was in place, the response would not need to be loud to be effective, it would simply need to be precise. I agreed, because precision had always been my strength. I returned home before they noticed I had been gone, the boxes still In place, the house still appearing to shift in the direction they expected, Sophie greeted me with a quick smile, asking if I had gone for a walk, and I said yes, because it was easier than explaining anything more. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her phone, likely making plans I was no longer meant to be part of. I continued packing, moving through each room with quiet focus, selecting what mattered, leaving what did not. Because sometimes letting go of physical things makes it easier to hold on to what cannot be taken, and by the end of that day, the house looked less like a home and more like a transition, a space between what had been and what was about to happen, and they believed they were guiding that transition, they believed they were in control of it. But control is not about who moves first, it is about who understands the outcome before anyone else realizes it is already decided. By the fourth day, the house no longer felt like a place I lived in, it felt like a stage that had already been reset for the next act. The boxes lined the walls neatly, leaving open spaces where furniture once stood, and Sophie moved through those spaces with a kind of quiet ownership that she no longer bothered to hide. She spoke more freely now, not just about plans, but about changes she intended to make, colors she wanted to repaint, rooms she would convert, the future unfolding in her words as if the present had already been cleared away. Daniel followed her lead more openly too, discussing timelines, mentioning real estate agents, even laughing once about how quickly everything was coming together, and I listened, always listening, because when people believe something is settled, they stop choosing their words carefully, they stop guarding details, and details are where everything begins to take shape. I continued packing. Slower now, not because there was less to do, but because timing had shifted, every movement measured, every decision intentional. I made sure certain boxes were visible, certain items left behind just long enough to be noticed, photographs still on the walls, a few personal things in place, just enough to maintain the image they expected. That I was still in the process of leaving, not finished, not fully gone, because as long as I was still there, even partially, they would continue revealing what they believed was already theirs. That afternoon, Sophie approached me with a clipboard, her tone casual but purposeful, asking me to review a few additional documents, small things, she said, just to make everything smoother. Her words carefully chosen, her posture relaxed, but her eyes focused, watching for hesitation. I took the papers without question, scanning them slowly, not for understanding, because I already understood, but for confirmation, dates, signatures, clauses that aligned with what Thomas had shown me, each line reinforcing the pattern, the structure they believed was solid. I nodded when I finished, handed them back, and said I trusted them to handle it, and that single sentence did exactly what I expected. It removed the last layer of caution. Sophie smiled, not just pleased, but assured, and Daniel looked relieved in a way that suggested he had been waiting for that moment, waiting for complete acceptance. That was when the shift became undeniable. They no longer saw me as part of the equation. I was simply the final step in a process that was already moving forward. That evening, I made one more visit to the office, later than usual, the sky already dimming as the streetlights came on. Thomas reviewed the new documents with quiet precision, pointing out inconsistencies, timing issues, things that would matter when the moment came, and we discussed the final phase, not in dramatic terms, not as a confrontation, but as a correction, something that would unfold with clarity rather than force. He reminded me again that patience was what made it effective, that allowing everything to reach its natural conclusion would make the response stronger, undeniable. I agreed, because by now the pattern was complete. There was nothing left for them to hide. I returned home to find the lights still on, voices low in the living room. I paused just long enough to hear Sophie speaking, her tone confident, almost celebratory, mentioning that everything was nearly finalized, that once I was out, there would be no delays, no complications. Daniel responded with agreement, his voice steadier now, more certain than it had been before, and that certainty told me everything I needed to know. They believed it was finished, they believed they had reached the end of the process, and when people believe they have reached the end, they stop preparing for what comes next. I stepped inside, making just enough noise to be heard, and the conversation stopped instantly, replaced by the same polite tones, the same careful expressions, but the difference was clear. They were no longer performing for me, they were simply maintaining appearances, and appearances are easy to manage when you know exactly what is behind them. I smiled, greeted them, and continued up the stairs, my steps steady, my mind clear, because everything was now in place, every detail aligned, every assumption they had made working exactly as intended. Not for them, but for me, and as I closed the bedroom door behind me, I understood that the next time we sat down together, it would not be about what they believed they had taken, it would be about what they never truly had in the first place. The morning everything shifted, the house was quieter than it had been in days, not because there was nothing left to say, but because they believed everything had already been decided. Sophie was the first to speak, her voice carrying a calm confidence as she walked into the kitchen with her phone in hand. Mentioning that the agent would be stopping by later to take photos, she said it casually, like it was a detail already agreed upon. Not something that required discussion. Daniel followed behind her, nodding in agreement, adding that it would be quick, just a formality before listing, and I listened, standing by the counter, my hands resting lightly against the surface, taking in every word, every assumption, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, not the signing, not the packing, but the certainty in their voices, the complete absence of doubt. That is when people stop being careful. I turned slowly, meeting Sophie's gaze first, then Daniel's, and for the first time since this began, I did not soften my expression, I did not nod, I did not agree, I simply said that would not be necessary. The silence that followed was immediate, heavy, unexpected. Sophie blinked once, as if she had misheard me, her composure holding for just a second before tightening slightly at the edges. She asked what I meant, her tone still polite but no longer warm, and I repeated it, calmly, clearly, that the house would not be listed. Daniel shifted where he stood, his eyes moving between us, confusion beginning to replace the quiet certainty he had carried all week. Sophie straightened, the clipboard still in her hand, her fingers tightening just enough to give away the tension beneath her control. She reminded me of the paperwork, of the decisions we had discussed, of everything that had already been put into motion, and I listened, allowing her to finish, because interruption would only create noise. And noise was not what this moment required. When she was done, I reached for the folder I had kept close, the same one that had moved with me from room to room, and placed it gently on the counter between us. I opened it slowly, not for effect, but because precision matters, and I explained, in the same calm tone I had used all week, that the documents they had prepared were incomplete, that the transfers they believed were finalized had not met the conditions required to make them valid. That certain protections had been in place long before they began their process, protections that required oversight, verification, and consent that could not be assumed or simplified. Sophie's expression shifted then, not dramatically, but enough, the confidence replaced by calculation, the kind that appears when someone realizes the situation is no longer as controlled as they believed. Daniel stepped closer, his voice uncertain as he asked what I was saying, and I answered him directly. That nothing had been transferred in the way they thought, that the authority they believed they had did not exist in the form they had been using, that everything they had done was documented, traceable, and subject to review. The words settled into the room slowly, not as an accusation, not as a confrontation, but as a correction, and corrections do not require raised voices, they require clarity. Sophie set the clipboard down, her movements measured now, her tone sharper as she questioned the information, suggesting there must be some misunderstanding, but I did not argue. I simply closed the folder and told her that everything would be clarified soon, that the appropriate steps were already in motion, that there was no need for further discussion today. Daniel looked at me then. Really looked, for the first time in days, and what I saw in his expression was not anger, not even disappointment, but uncertainty, the kind that appears when a narrative begins to fall apart. Sophie said nothing more, her silence louder than anything she had said before, and I turned, not waiting for a response, not offering one, because the moment did not belong to them anymore, it had already shifted. And as I walked toward the stairs, leaving them standing in that kitchen they believed they controlled, I understood that the next phase would not require effort, only time, because once certainty is broken, everything that follows begins to unravel on its own. The meeting happened 3 days later, not in the kitchen, not in the house they had already begun to treat as theirs, but in a quiet office where everything was measured, documented, and impossible to reinterpret. Sophie arrived first, her posture composed but tighter than before, her confidence no longer effortless. Daniel followed, his steps slower, his expression uncertain in a way that suggested he had begun to understand that something had shifted beyond his control. I was already seated. When they entered, the folder resting calmly in front of me, Thomas beside me, his presence steady, professional, not confrontational, just precise, the kind of presence that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Sophie greeted him with a polite nod, her tone controlled as she took her seat, already preparing to assert what she believed to be her position. But Thomas began before she could, outlining the situation clearly, methodically, explaining that the documents they had relied on lacked the necessary verification, that the transfers they assumed were valid had not been executed under conditions that met the legal requirements established years prior, that safeguards had been intentionally placed to prevent exactly this kind of oversight. And as he spoke, I watched their reactions carefully. Sophie's composure held at first, but only on the surface, her eyes narrowing slightly, recalculating, searching for a way to regain ground. Daniel listened in silence, his hands resting on his knees, his posture no longer certain, as if each sentence was removing something he had believed was already secured. Thomas continued, presenting timelines, records, confirmations that left no space for interpretation. Everything they had done was documented, but not in the way they expected. Their actions had created a record, a clear sequence that could not be undone by explanation or intention, only by correction. And correction was already in motion. Sophie finally spoke, her voice sharper now, questioning the process, suggesting there had been a misunderstanding, that everything had been done with my agreement. And I met her gaze without hesitation, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. I told her that agreement without full disclosure is not agreement, that trust is not permission, and that what they believed they had secured was never theirs to take in the way they had attempted. The room fell quiet then, not tense, not dramatic, just still, because the outcome had already settled into place. Daniel looked at me again, and this time there was no avoidance, only realization, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been set in motion. Sophie said nothing more, her silence no longer strategic, but necessary, because there was nothing left to negotiate. Thomas closed the folder, his tone final as he explained the next steps, the restoration of control, the formal acknowledgement of what had always been in place, the process moving forward not as a dispute, but as a correction of an assumption that should never have been made. We stood, not in conflict, not in resolution, but in completion, because this was never about winning, it was about restoring what had never truly been lost. I walked out of that office without looking back, not because I needed distance, but because I no longer needed to confirm anything. The air outside felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clear, like something had been returned to its proper place. I drove home, not to the house they had already begun to claim, but to the understanding that a house is never just walls and ownership, it is time, intention, memory, things that cannot be transferred through paperwork or assumption. When I stepped inside, the boxes were still there, the spaces still open, but the meaning had changed. They were no longer signs of departure, they were simply objects waiting to be put back where they belonged. I moved through the rooms slowly, not reclaiming, not reasserting, just existing in a space that had never truly stopped being mine. And later, when the house was quiet again, when there were no voices filling the silence with plans that no longer applied, I sat in the same chair I had always sat in, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I understood something with complete certainty. I did not take anything back, I simply allowed the truth to return on its own terms, and that was enough.